I didn't say a word. That's the part no one believes when I tell the story. They expect me to say I confronted them right there in the kitchen, or that I flipped the table, or that I grabbed my brother by the collar and dragged him out the front door. That's what people expect from a man, especially a man my age. 63 years of living, you'd think you'd know by now how you'd react to something like that. But I didn't do any of those things. I just stood there in the hallway, still holding 2 glasses of sweet tea, watching through the half-open door to the back sunroom, and I went completely quiet inside. Not calm. Quiet is different. Calm means you're at peace. What I felt was more like the moment just before a car accident, when your brain registers what's happening, but your body hasn't caught up yet. Everything slowed down. The sound of the football game in the living room behind me, the smell of my wife's pecan pie still in the air, the way my brother's hand was pressed flat against the small of her back, and the way she leaned into him like she'd done it 100 times before. Because I think she had. I backed up 3 steps into the hallway, set both glasses of tea down on the little console table where we keep the mail, walked back into the living room and sat in my armchair and watched the 4th quarter like nothing had happened. My nephew asked me if I wanted more pie. I said yes. That was Thanksgiving. My name isn't important. What's important is that I was married for 31 years to a woman I thought I knew the way I knew the back of my own hand. We built everything together, the house, the savings, the life. Raised our daughter, survived the hard years when money was tight and the good years when it finally wasn't. I retired from the Water Authority 2 years ago after 34 years of service. My wife, who I'll call my wife because that's what she was and what she still legally is as I write this, had her own bookkeeping business she ran out of the house. My brother, 3 years younger than me, lived 40 minutes away in the same town where we grew up. He came to every holiday, every birthday. He was the best man at our wedding. I want you to understand what I'm saying. Not a coworker, not a neighbor. My brother. The man who taught me to fish. The man I called when our father died. The man who sat with me in the hospital the night our daughter was born and cried the same way I did when they put her in my arms. That man. After Thanksgiving, I didn't sleep well. I lay in the dark beside my wife and stared at the ceiling and tried to talk myself out of what I'd seen. I'm 63 years old. I've worn glasses for 20 years. The lighting in that sunroom was poor. It was a long drive, and I was tired. Maybe it was a hug that lasted too long and I misread it. Maybe the hand on her back meant nothing. I almost convinced myself. Then I started remembering things I hadn't let myself notice before. The way my wife's phone had started going face down on the counter in the evenings. The weekend last spring when she drove to her sister's house for what she said was a girls' trip, but when I mentioned it to her sister at Easter, her sister gave me a look I couldn't quite read and changed the subject. The fact that my brother had started calling less. We used to talk every Sunday. Somewhere around February, he'd stopped initiating, and when I called him, the conversations were shorter. I told myself he was busy. I told myself a lot of things. I'm a slow thinker. That's what my wife used to tease me about, kindly, in the early years. She'd say I was like a freight train, took a long time to get moving. But once I did, nothing could stop me. I started getting moving. I didn't hire anyone. I didn't need to. I just started paying attention to things I'd been too trusting to pay attention to before. I noticed that my wife drove to town every Tuesday and Thursday morning, ostensibly for errands, and was never gone less than 2 hours. I noticed that the joint savings account, which I checked online for the first time in probably 3 years, had $14,000 less in it than I expected. I noticed that my brother, who claimed to be renovating his kitchen, had taken 2 separate weekend trips since October that he'd been vague about when I asked. I didn't say anything to either of them. I just watched, and I started writing things down. The person who changed everything was my sister-in-law, my brother's wife. I'll call her my sister-in-law because that's what she is, the woman he married 24 years ago. A quiet, sharp woman who grew up in rural Kentucky and never missed a thing in her life. She called me on a Wednesday in early December, which was unusual. She called my cell, not the house phone. She asked if I could meet her for coffee. I said, of course. We set it for Friday morning at a diner halfway between our houses. She was already there when I arrived. She had a coffee in front of her and her hands wrapped around the mug, and she looked like a woman who hadn't slept. I sat down across from her, and the waitress came, and I ordered coffee, and we made small talk for about 90 seconds. And then my sister-in-law set down her mug and looked at me and said, quietly, "How long have you known?" I looked at her across the table. "Since Thanksgiving," I said. She nodded slowly. She said she'd known since August. We sat with that for a minute. The diner was mostly empty. An old man was eating eggs alone by the window. Country music played low from a speaker somewhere near the kitchen. I wasn't sure you knew, she said. I wasn't sure how to tell you. I kept thinking maybe I'm wrong, but I wasn't wrong. No, I said. You weren't. She told me what she knew. Some of it I'd pieced together, some of it I hadn't. The Tuesday and Thursday mornings weren't errands. My brother had a standing arrangement at a hunting cabin 45 minutes north that belonged to a friend of his. The friend thought he used it for fishing. My sister-in-law had found receipts. She'd found messages on an old tablet my brother had stopped using and left in the garage without wiping. She showed me some of what she'd saved. I read enough to know that what I'd seen in the Sunroom on Thanksgiving was not a one-time thing and had not been a misread hug. It had been going on for at least 2 years. I put her phone down on the table and looked out the window. What do you want to do? I said. She said she'd been thinking about that for 4 months. She said she didn't want to do anything rash. She said she'd consulted a divorce attorney in a town an hour away, one who didn't know either of our families. She said, and this is the part I keep turning over in my mind, she said, I want to do this right, not fast. Right. I understood what she meant. When you've been married as long as we had, when you've built what we'd built, there's a lot at stake in how you handle the ending. Do it wrong and you lose half of everything and spend years in court. Do it right and you protect yourself. She'd already thought about this longer than I had. I decided to let her lead. When? I said. She wrapped both hands around her coffee again. Christmas, she said. We're all supposed to be at your house. She was right. Every year since our mother passed, we hosted Christmas at our house. Both sides of the family, my daughter and her husband driving in from Tennessee, my brother and his wife, cousins. It was always the biggest gathering of the year, 2 weeks away. That gives us 2 weeks, I said. 2 weeks, she agreed. I drove home that afternoon with the heater running and the radio off. My wife was in the kitchen when I came in, working on the bookkeeping at the table, and she looked up and smiled and asked how my coffee with her friend had gone. I told her I was meeting an old colleague from the water authority, and I smiled back and said it was good, just catching up. I made dinner that night. Pork chops, which were her favorite. We ate at the table and talked about our daughter's visit and what we needed to pick up at the store before Christmas. She told me she'd been thinking about rearranging the living room for the holidays, and I said that sounded nice. After dinner, I washed the dishes, and she dried them, and we stood at the sink the way we had for 30 years, and I thought about the first Christmas we spent in this house, when our daughter was 4, and we'd stayed up until 2 in the morning putting together a bicycle, laughing at the instructions. I didn't sleep again that night, but I didn't let her see that. The next 2 weeks were the strangest of my life. I've read that soldiers talk about a particular kind of dissociation, where you're moving and talking and functioning, but there's a part of you that's standing slightly outside your own body, watching. That's the closest I can come to describing it. I went to the store. I hung Christmas lights on the gutters. I talked to my daughter on the phone and told her we were looking forward to seeing her. I talked to my brother once, for about 10 minutes, about what he was bringing for Christmas dinner, and the whole time I looked at his face on the video call and tried to find something there I recognized, and I couldn't. My sister-in-law and I exchanged a handful of texts. She had done what she called organizing her affairs. I had done the same. I met with my own attorney in the same town she'd used, a different practice. I'd made copies of the bank records in several months of account statements. I'd spoken to our accountant, who is a friend of mine and a man I trust, about what I suspected and what my options were. The $14,000 was not an accident and was not an emergency expense. It had come out in 11 transfers over 18 months, none large enough to trigger any automatic alert, all of them on days when my wife had something else going on that would have explained her being distracted if I'd happened to check. I hadn't happened to check. That was on me. I own that. But I own it quietly. It's the kind of thing a man my age, who grew up in a generation where trust was the whole point of marriage, has to make a kind of peace with. You didn't marry someone and then monitor them, you trusted. That was the deal. The fact that she had used my trust as cover for all of this is not a flaw in me. I have to keep reminding myself of that. Christmas Eve arrived clear and cold. My daughter and her husband had come in the night before. I'd stayed up late with my son-in-law, a good man, a quiet man who builds furniture in his garage for a hobby. We'd had a couple of bourbons and he'd asked me how I was doing, really, and I'd said I was fine, and I almost told him everything right then, but I didn't. It wasn't his burden to carry into Christmas morning. People started arriving around noon. My brother and his wife came at 12:30. My brother came in with a big pan of mac and cheese and a case of beer, and a voice that filled the room the way it always had. And he hugged my daughter and shook my son-in-law's hand and clapped me on the shoulder and said, "Merry Christmas, brother." And I said it back. My wife was in the kitchen. She came out to greet everyone. She and my brother's wife hugged the way women do when they've known each other for over 2 decades. I watched my sister-in-law's face over my wife's shoulder, steady as a rock. The day went the way Christmas goes. Too much food. Football on in the background. The children, my brother's youngest, is still a teenager on their phones. We ate early, around 3 o'clock. The big table extended and loaded down, and I sat at the head of it and looked at every face there and thought about every Christmas that had come before, going back to when our parents were alive and the whole family was together and everything was simple and whole. My daughter gave a toast. She thanked everyone for coming. She said how much it meant to have family together. She raised her glass, and everyone raised their glasses, and I raised mine, and we drank. My sister-in-law caught my eye across the table. After dinner, when most people had drifted to the living room, my sister-in-law asked if she could speak to her husband privately for a moment, said she needed his help with something in the car. My brother got up good-naturedly and followed her to the front door. I stood up and said I had something to give them, and followed. My wife was at the sink again. My daughter was with her. My son-in-law was in the living room with the others. My sister-in-law closed the front door behind us. The three of us stood in the driveway in the cold air, my breath fogging in front of me. My brother looked between us with an expression that was starting to shift. "What's going on?" he said. My sister-in-law opened her coat and pulled out a folded envelope. She handed it to him. He opened it. He read it. He stood there in the driveway reading those pages, and I watched his face the way I'd been watching everyone's faces for 2 weeks. And I want to tell you that I saw remorse there, that there was a moment where the brother I grew up with looked at me with something that resembled the shame I needed him to feel. But what I saw was more like calculation. He looked up from the papers, and the first thing he said was, "Where did you get these?" My sister-in-law said, "Does it matter?" He looked at me. He started to say something about misunderstanding, about context, about how things weren't what they looked like, and I held up one hand and he stopped. Just stopped. Maybe it was something in my face. I've been told I have a face when I'm serious. That doesn't leave a lot of room for argument. I said, "I'm not going to do this tonight. Not with my daughter inside. Not on Christmas." He looked relieved for 1 second. And in that second, I saw something I'd never seen in him before. He thought he was going to get out of it. He thought the fact that I was keeping my voice low meant there was still room to maneuver. "But it's going to happen," I said, "soon. And you should know that I know everything." My sister-in-law said the same to him in her own words, quietly and precisely, in a way that made it clear she had known longer than I had and was further along in the process of moving on. He went back inside. The three of us went back inside. For the next 2 hours, we sat in my living room with my family and opened gifts and watched my daughter laugh at something her husband said. And my brother sat across from me, and I looked at the tree and not at him. And my wife sat on the couch with a glass of wine and her legs tucked up under her the way she always sat. And I thought about 31 years and how a thing can look one way from the outside and be something else entirely from within. Everyone went home around 8. My daughter and her husband were staying through the 27th. After everyone left, she helped me clean up the kitchen, and at one point she put her hand on my arm and said, "Dad, are you okay?" And I said I was just tired. It was a long day. She studied my face the way she'd done since she was small, the way she'd always been able to see through me, and she said, "Okay." But I could tell she wasn't fully satisfied. I told my wife on the 26th, not with shouting, not with accusations. I sat her down at the kitchen table, the same table where she'd done her bookkeeping, the same table where we'd eaten 10,000 meals. And I told her what I knew and how I knew it, and I put the copies of the bank records on the table in front of her. And I told her that I had already spoken with an attorney and that I wanted her to know exactly where things stood before we moved forward. She didn't deny it. That's the thing I want people to understand. She didn't cry. She didn't beg. She sat there with her hands in her lap and she listened. And when I finished, she said, "I didn't want it to happen this way." I asked her how she had wanted it to happen. She didn't answer that. I asked her about the money. She said some of it she could pay back. I said the attorney would address all of that. She nodded. She asked if I was going to tell our daughter. I said our daughter was going to know the truth, but that I would handle that in my own time, in my own way, and that was not her decision to make anymore. She slept in the guest room that night. My daughter figured it out on her own on the 27th, the morning she and her husband were leaving. She found me on the back porch early, before the sun was fully up, sitting with my coffee. She sat down in the chair beside me. We looked at the backyard, the dormant garden, the bird feeders she'd helped me hang when she was 12, the old oak tree we'd always meant to have trimmed. She didn't ask me anything. She put her hand over mine on the arm of the chair, and we sat there like that until the light changed. She said, "I love you, Dad." I said, "I love you too, sweetheart." She said, "You're the most decent man I've ever known." I didn't know what to say to that, so I just squeezed her hand, and we watched a cardinal land on the bird feeder and look around and fly away. The months that followed were not simple. Divorce after 31 years never is. There were attorneys and documents and difficult conversations, and at least one afternoon where I sat alone in this house and thought about the fact that I would be 64 years old starting over. And I won't pretend that didn't frighten me. It did. There is a particular kind of loneliness in a house that used to be full and is now quiet, and I had underestimated it. My brother's marriage ended too. My sister-in-law is doing better than any of us, I think. She is one of those women who runs toward hard things rather than away from them. And she had spent 4 months preparing for what came next in a way that most people never have the discipline to do. I have a great deal of respect for her. My brother called me twice during the divorce process. Both times I let it go to voicemail. Both times he said words like complicated and I never meant for, and you have to believe me. I listened to the messages once each and deleted them. There may come a time when I can have that conversation. That time isn't now. What I want to say, and I'm saying it to whoever is watching this, whoever is in the middle of something like this and wondering if they're making too big a deal of it, wondering if they should just keep quiet and absorb it and move on the way. Men of my generation were taught to what I want to say is this. Quiet isn't the same as weakness. I was quiet for 2 weeks after Thanksgiving. I was quiet through Christmas dinner. I was quiet in my own house while I documented and prepared and got my affairs in order. But quiet was a choice I made. It wasn't something that was done to me. There's a difference between choosing silence and having silence forced on you. I also want to say, the part that hurt most was not what I think people would expect. It wasn't the betrayal itself, though that was bad enough. It wasn't even the money. It was the realization that I had been sitting across the table from 2 people I loved completely for years, and had not known them at all. The version of my brother and my wife that I had carried in my mind, trusted, leaned on, that version was a thing I had built out of history and habit and love, and it was not accurate. I had been, in some sense, alone in my own marriage for a long time without knowing it. I don't say that for sympathy. I say it because I think it's important to name it. We talk about betrayal as though it's one event, one night, one kiss, one discovered secret, but that's not really what it is. Betrayal is a long accumulation of small choices made by someone who has decided that their own wants matter more than your trust. And the person being betrayed usually doesn't know because they're too busy trusting. Trust is not stupidity. I want to be clear about that too. I'm in the house still. My daughter and her husband have offered to have me move down to Tennessee, and I'm thinking about it more than I expected to. The house is paid off and it's mine. That part was straightforward, but a house is different when you rattle around in it alone. I've started having coffee with a friend from the water authority most Wednesday mornings. I've gone back to fishing a few times, alone, which is different but not entirely bad. There is a small lake about 20 minutes from here where the bass are particularly stupid in the early morning, and I've sat on that bank in the cold more times than I can count, and just been quiet in a way that feels more like the real thing now. My daughter calls every few days. She checks on me in a way that is persistent and gentle, and that I find embarrassing and also deeply comforting. She is, without question, the best thing that came out of 31 years, and she is entirely herself, nothing to do with the wreckage, a complete and separate person who existed before any of this and will be standing long after it. Somebody told me recently, a man I know from church, who went through his own difficult divorce about 8 years ago, he told me that the first year is mostly just getting through the first year. He said it like it was simple. Like all you have to do is put one foot forward and then the other, and not look too far ahead, and eventually you'll find yourself somewhere further along than you expected. He said he'd been surprised by what was on the other side of it. I asked him what was on the other side. He thought about it for a moment. He said, yourself. Just you. And it turns out, that's not as bad as you thought. I'm not there yet. I'm still in the getting through the year part. But I believe him. I've made it this far on the simple principle that a man should conduct himself, in the worst moments, the same way he would want to be remembered. Not perfectly, but honestly, without cruelty, without letting his pain make him into something he'd be ashamed of. I put 2 glasses of sweet tea down on a console table in a hallway, and I walked back to my armchair, and I waited until I was ready, and I did this the right way. That's what I've got. That's the whole story. For whoever needed to hear it tonight, you already know what you saw. You're not imagining it, and you don't have to blow everything up tonight to prove it to yourself. Give yourself a little time. Get your affairs in order. Let the truth do the work. It's patient. It'll wait. It only ever needed you to stop looking away from it.